I have the great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Julian Cribb. I actually heard Julian 2 years ago in the International Horticulture Congress in Australia, Brisbane. And when we decided to actually organize this symposium, myself and 2 other members of the organizing committee that were there with me that day, we thought that Julian would be the best person to open up this conference. We were very inspired and felt really nice that we are working in this area. So Julian is an author and science communicator with a big presence in agriculture journalism, and he had published a lot of work, including 8 books. I would like to welcome Julian Cribb, that he's going to talk about the age of food. One more housekeeping thing. When we start questions, please wait for the microphone to come, because there is another room that people are actually watching us, and it will be good for have the microphone to hear the questions. Welcome, Julian.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for such a warm welcome. It's an honour and a privilege to be here at the cutting edge of the next food revolution. First of all, a health warning. The first part of what I'm going to talk about is some pretty serious stuff, okay? If you are in need of oxygen, little yellow masks will fall from the ceiling. There's a defibrillator at the front desk. The second part, we'll move on to that, where I focus more on urban food systems, much more optimistic and positive, I assure you. It's worth waiting for. Anyway, so on. Food is poised to change more profoundly than in any previous era of human history. What we eat a century from now, how we produce it and consume it, its health value and its composition will be as strange to us today as our own ancestors would find the modern diet in this, the era of cosmopolitan cuisine, cold storage, takeaway, manufactured food, celebrity chefs, and cooking shows. Now, this food revolution will arise out of fierce demand and resource pressures that are building up in the world food system, coupled with the advent of remarkable new technologies and emerging trends in farming, health, and sustainability. Today, I'm going to make a number of predictions about the future of food based on emerging trends and constraints, and not all of them are pleasant to hear, but they are nevertheless very important. Many, however, foreshadow magnificent new opportunities in this, the age of food. Now, tonight, around 200,000 more people will sit down to dinner than sat down last night. By the latter part of this century, we could be dealing with 10 to 11 billion mouths to feed. And it's not just a matter of babies being born. It's also people living longer lives. You know, the average person in a wealthy country like yours or mine eats 35,000 more meals than a person in a very poor country. To meet both population growth and economic demand, global food availability must double by the 2060s. However, almost everything that we need to do that by traditional means is becoming scarce. Soil, water, nutrients, energy, technology, fish, capital, and a stable, reliable climate. And it is this great collision between demands and scarcities that is making food the challenge of our age. The consequences of this multiple stress on food security are not well understood by governments or by consumers, or indeed, I might add, by food companies. Like the Indian blind men in the fable, they are seeing only parts of the beast. This is what science terms a wicked problem. Let me explain a bit. The world is already at or close to peak water. In China, India, the US, the Middle East and North Africa, groundwater is being mined to grow food faster than it replenishes. I'm told there are bits of the Ogallala that will take 6,000 years to refill, for example. A NASA satellite survey of all the world's groundwater reveals that of the world's 21 great groundwater basins, 13 are in distress. Rainfall in the Great Grain Bowls is becoming less reliable. Snowpack on high mountains is shrinking. Lakes, rivers and aquifers in dry lands are vanishing. If nothing changes in how we humans manage water, our most precious resource, by 2030, demand for water will outstrip supply by 40%, according to the United Nations. To put this in a geopolitical perspective, the number of humans facing acute water stress at least 1 month per year is already 4 billion. Okay, it's a large chunk of the population. Maybe I went too fast. There's a war for water raging as miners, frackers, and the megacities compete for the only remaining cheap source of water. That's the one used by farmers. And in a fight between farmers and cities or mining giants, we all know who wins. And food security in the long run is going to be the loser. We each use about 1,400 tonnes of fresh water every single year, 3/4 of that in the form of food. Over a lifetime, each one of us will personally consume enough fresh water to float the USS Enterprise. That's something worth reflecting on, 7 billion aircraft carriers. The challenge that this presents to the world's irrigators, for example, is mind-boggling. And irrigation currently supplies about 40% of the world's food, using 2/3 of its available fresh water. But by 2050, according to FAO, it will have to grow 2/3 of the world's food on about 1/3 of the world's water. So this is calling for an increase in water use efficiency of the order of 200 or 300% worldwide, which is a pretty formidable task. As with water, so with soil. Earth scientists estimate that the world is currently losing about 75 billion tonnes of topsoil every year. Most of that is due to farming. The University of Sheffield came up with an estimate a couple of months ago that we have actually shed 1/3 of the world's topsoil since 1975. Satellites are showing that the world's farm area is in fact shrinking at the moment by around about 1% a year. And if you straight line project that, you can see what's going to happen to the area farmed against what we've got to do with food. If this continues, according to Professor John Crawford, an Australian, the world may run out of good arable soils within about 60 years. Now, this is an issue that really is not top of head with governments, as far as I can see, anywhere in the world. And we've talked about the soil problem for going on a century now, but it's still on the back burner, ladies and gentlemen. There is a solution. In fact, there are many solutions, but we need to change. It involves changing how we produce food and also how we reward farmers. At the same time, civilization has mined its soils of the minerals and micronutrients that are vital for health and life. An American study shows that we now have to eat 5 tomatoes or cauliflowers to get the same essential minerals as our grandparents got from eating 1. Okay, that's just the NPK system going forward. Scientists suspect that this depletion of essential nutrients is linked to the global pandemic of chronic diseases that we're now starting to see in the bulk of the population. Now, there is a plain solution to this. Again, we have to recycle all our nutrients, not just chuck them away, which is what we do at the moment. To waste nothing ever again. How do we do that? This feeds into this other issue. The modern diet, is not a healthy one. Here in America, in Australia, around about 3 people in every 4 die by their own hand. That is the hand holding the fork, right? Chronic diseases, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, obesity, just that they are the major thing that's occupying the health system. 3/4 of the health budgets of these countries is devoted to trying to cure the incurable. In statistical terms, fun fact, food is 6 times more deadly than tobacco. So we've got to start thinking about this diet quite seriously. It's not as good as we pretend it is. We've got to look ourselves in the eye on this one. The important thing to remember is that food deaths are preventable deaths. This can change. It can change quite quickly. And a healthy diet holds the key to that. At the same time, our insatiable hunger is the chief factor in the extermination of the world's species, the worst extinction event in 60 million years. By mid-century, humans are predicted to dominate half of the Earth's biological productivity. Half. It's a phenomenal number. And that's placing our own future on a razor's edge. According to this chap here, E.O. Wilson, who I'm sure you've all read, we are tearing down the biosphere. I doubt the world can sustain this. But you know, there is a solution, and it lies in cities. But let's think about cities for a moment. You know, they've kind of sprung up and they've changed phenomenally from what they were in the old days. By mid-century, there's going to be 7 billion occupants of the world's cities. They're going to occupy a land area the size of Australia. That's land that'll never see the plough again. There will be many cities with 20 and 40 million people in them. Guangzhou, Shenzhen will have 120 million people living in one city. Now, these great cities have one terrible flaw. They cannot feed themselves. They are unlike all the other cities of history in that regard. They rely upon a river of trucks coming every night to restock the shops and the markets. Any break in that flow, an oil crisis, a war, a storm, a flood, and a giant city could starve. We're going to see it happen in our lifetimes on our smartphones. Now, the obvious solution again is for cities to be far more self-sufficient, to grow far more of their own food than they are today. We have to transition between the rural agriculture that we've been accustomed to since the Bronze Age and the new agriculture that is going to take place in the cities themselves. The modern food chain depends critically on oil. For farming, for transport, chilling, cooking, etc. Each of us eats the diesel extract from 66 barrels of oil a year. That's what's on your dinner plate. So just think about that, 66 barrels of oil just to put that food on your plate. But you know, one of the, you can argue about peak oil, so, you know, and people do, but there's a fact that not many people are aware of. The number of new cars in the world is growing 7 times faster than the amount of new oil is being discovered. Okay, and I think, you know, having observed quite a number of energy shocks over many years, this means that more energy shocks are likely to be on the way. And an energy shock these days doesn't just mean an energy shock, it means a food shock too, because of the fact that our food comes these immense distances to reach us. To prevent this, we need a renewable source of energy for food production and transport. More on this shortly. This is an issue you will all be familiar with. Ours is the first generation in the whole of human history to throw away half our food. Now, this picture from the New York Times is what the typical family throws in the trash every month. Almost half of the efforts of the world's farmers and the world's agricultural scientists now goes to landfill. This is neither moral, nor economic, nor sustainable. At the same time, the supply of high-grade nutrients, which underpin the modern food system, are running down. You know, the very high analysis deposits that have supplied our farms over decades are now becoming pretty scarce worldwide. And this is threatening food security in the mid-century also. So again, we need to be thinking about how do we recycle those nutrients? How do we not throw them away or put them in a system which dumps them on the bottom of the ocean? The world fish catch peaked in 1994, believe it or not. It has been stagnant or declining for over 20 years. What this basically says is we're not going to get another 80 million tonnes of fish out of the ocean as we double food production. You know, as we strive for a doubling in food production, we're not going to be able to double the wild harvest of fish. Visionary solutions are called for, and I will talk some about them. This is something that really upsets me because I'm a science journalist, ag journalist. I've been reporting on this, since the early 1970s. For a quarter of a century, the effort that powers the food machine worldwide has been stagnant or even declining in terms of its funding. Today, it is less than 3 cents in the science dollar worldwide is spent on agricultural food science. Let me put it in another perspective. The total spend on ag and food science today is about $50 billion a year, which sounds like a lot of money. But on the other hand, we also spend $1,800 billion a year on new weapons. So we could define the human species as a creature that invests 35 times more on better ways to kill each other than we do on better ways to feed each other. It also suggests where the solution may come from. It is time for a new focus on building world peace through food and not war. Now, if we can transition some of those military budgets out of arms making and into food making, we can actually increase the amount of peace in the world. It is absolutely noticeable that nearly all of the wars that have happened in the last 30 years have taken place in countries which are food, land and water insecure. And how many wars have taken place in places like North America, Northern Europe, Australasia? None, because we've got enough to eat. When you don't have enough food, people get pretty upset with one another. It is a casus belli underlying all the other differences that people have. So I'm here calling for the world to invest 1/10 of its current military spending in new food science and technology. Thank you. To summarise all that stuff, every meal that each of us eats costs the earth 10 kilos of topsoil, 1.3 litres of oil, 800 litres of water, 1/3 of a gram of pesticide, 3.5 kilos of carbon dioxide. That's every meal, every day, for every person. We are devouring the planet in order to feed ourselves. This cannot be sustained, and it will not feed a population of 10 billion in a warming world in the long run. It has to change. The Holocene climate, we know, the one that gave birth to agriculture, is extinct. It's never coming back. 2 degrees of global warming are pretty much unavoidable at this stage, and that's going to make outdoor harvests very unreliable in the world's great grain bowls. For example, World Bank forecasts that India could lose up to 45% of its grain yields without adaptation. The scientific estimates that I've seen are really 5 degrees of warming, which is the kind of the worst case scenario for the end of this century, could halve global food production at the very time we're attempting to double it. So we have to cycle a heck of a lot faster in order to stand still in this game. Interesting prediction, the University of Arizona, soy and corn yields could drop by between 62 and 83% without adaptation. Ouch. Obviously, this is going to have a huge impact on food prices, food security and availability. It's going to affect every single person on the planet. This is how you feel climate change, right? It's not that it's a bit hotter outside. It's in the price that you will pay for food no matter where you live on Earth. This is how everybody will be affected. It is going to be the biggest personal impact of climate change of all. It is going to drive geopolitics, economics, migration, refugee tsunamis and war for much of this century. Over the coming decades, the world diet is going to shift from the one we're used to, the old European one, mainly grain, mainly meat, to one that is predominantly seafood and vegetables, a more Asian style of a diet. But on that transition rests the future of civilization. Worldwide, smart farmers, intelligent businesses, clever scientists are already investing ahead of that trend. I'm very excited about what I see and I hear as I go around the world and speak with groups of people such as yourselves who are working at the cutting edge of solving these problems. So the challenge of feeding the world over the coming century is vast, but the opportunities that arise are boundless. Farmers, scientists, cooks, entrepreneurs are reinventing food, how and where it is produced, prepared and sold. So let's just explore a few of these opportunities. You know, the world's cities concentrate about 4,000 cubic kilometres of fresh water. That's a heck of a lot of water, right? And then they mostly flush it down the sewer or down the drain into the river, into the ocean, and we never see it again, you know. They also concentrate well over half of our available nutrients. Cities are huge catchments for nutrients, but then they proceed to throw them in the landfill where they get mixed up with, you know, old chemicals and batteries and heaven knows what. You can never use them again if you do that. If you release them into the ocean, they're going straight to the bottom of the sea. You'll never see them again. You know, we'll never see them again. So we need to rethink this system that throws away water and nutrients. Cities are vast reservoirs. They are mines of these things. If they recycle both, our food supply will never fail. So urban food production can curb many undesirable aspects of the modern food chain, including the use of toxins, including cruelty to animals. It can swiftly introduce a vastly wider range of healthy, new foods, thus helping to reduce the toll of diet-related disease. It can help shift the world diet from unsustainable and unhealthy to healthy, clean and renewable. So the need to feed the megacities is sparking spectacular growth, as I'm sure you all know, in these urban food systems. FAO says there's already 800 million urban farmers. I guess these are mainly the old-fashioned sort, growing, you know, a few veggies on a small plot and things like that. But there is also some very high-tech stuff coming along. I would expect that the number of urban farmers will double by the mid-century. The modes of agriculture range from these high-tech glass skyscrapers producing vegetables, fruits, small livestock and fish to the large-scale cultivation of fresh foods on urban roofs and walls, to a renaissance in backyard, balcony, private allotment and public food garden production. Aquaponic farms are sprouting from Norway, Iceland and Canada to America, France, New Zealand and Australia. In Japan's Kanto region, I was fascinated to read the other day. I mean, the Kanto is the rice bowl of Japan. It's been the traditional place that was contested for throughout Japanese history because it was the place that fed the nation. There are now more than 200 high-tech urban farms set up. A 4,000-acre food park is proposed for the heart of Rotterdam. In Stockholm, government buildings like the one on the right are going to be growing food. Right, so along with your bureaucracy, you get fresh vegetables. You just and your red tape, you know. So the glass sphere at Linköping in Sweden is at last going up. There's an aeroponic farm growing hundreds of tons of fresh vegetables in New Jersey. Smart hospitals are culturing fresh vegetables on the roof to feed patients who are in recovery from surgery. On healthy diets, smart restaurants are offering their patrons a salad harvested only 15 minutes ago. In Singapore, bottom right, elderly retirees will grow their own food in vertical apartment farms. It's the Singapore government's solution to keeping people healthy and engaged and active in their old age, in a place where they don't have much room, they don't have many acres. In Australia, Blue Farms, are a mob just at the back of Sydney, are producing fresh fish and herbs. Those are the herbs you see in the little boxes in supermarkets and things like that on a huge conveyor belt system, growing barramundi, the big fish underneath there. In Norway, Miljøgartneret is producing 2,500 tonnes of organic tomatoes and peppers in just 7 months on 7 hectares. I think these people exemplify some of the food production systems of the future. Their hallmarks are recycling of all nutrients, water and energy, precision crop feeding. In Miljøgartneret, every plant has a sensor underneath it, and that tells them exactly what it needs that day, you know. So it's not like chucking a handful of fertiliser on the paddock as we did in the old days. This is precision feeding of individual plants. Low or zero use of chemicals, biological pest control and pollination, hospital-style crop hygiene, specialty crops, elite quality Typically, these types of enterprises use 1/10 or less of the land and water required by a traditional farm. And of course, they use far less fertilizer and far less fossil fuel to produce that food. So, you know, they really are moving outside the envelope of the things that constrain modern agriculture. The looming world crisis in arable soils and water is going to be solved in two other ways: by solar farms in desert countries and regions, and by floating farms in areas of dense population close to the sea. You've probably got these things in America. Here in Australia, the sundrop farms in the South Australian desert are basically using sunlight to desalinate salty groundwater. And these are the types of farms that are ideal for regions such as the Middle East, Central Asia, Desert Africa, Desert China, and so on. Using the same principle, again, sunlight to cleanse salt water, giant floating greenhouses are now being tested to meet the fresh food needs of the coastal megacities like Shanghai, Tokyo, Singapore, Mumbai, and so on. Green cities, alive with vegetation, fresh food, birds and insects, will replace the polluted, soulless, windy, concrete and glass urbanscapes of today. The new philosophy of agritecture envisions towering translucent vertical farms to green and adorn the skyline of the 21st century conurbation. These cities will recycle all their water and organic wastes back into sustainable food production. Their food supply will be climate-proof, unaffected by the shocks that will hammer traditional broadacre open-air agriculture. They will help to ensure a highly diverse local food supply that never fails. By 2050, I believe, with the right investment, urban production can supply half the world's food. But you know, there's another benefit to this, which is not generally thought of. Growing food in cities is going to bring immense relief to the stresses on the world's soils, water, biodiversity and rural communities. For the first time, humanity will be able to feed itself without plundering the natural world. And this is going to pave the way for the regeneration of grasslands, forests, rural landscapes and communities, the rewilding of half the earth, which is what E.O. Wilson has proposed in his latest book, and its imperiled wildlife. And instead of chucking farmers off the land, as we have been doing in your country and mine for the last 80, 90 odd years, society is actually going to start paying them, I believe, to work as stewards of the earth. They will work as eco-farmers, producing clean, sustainable food with much lighter footprint on the landscape than currently, but they will also be subsidised to look after the wild world. I believe that's the next trend. It's already starting in Europe, you know, but it's a trend that's got to take off worldwide, because we're not going to do it with rangers. There just ain't enough rangers in the world to save all those species that are under threat at the moment. So the new approach, urban food production, offers humanity a potential way to curb the sixth extinction. Very important thought. Aquaculture is already producing a third of the world's seafood, but there's becoming a culinary explosion in the range and choice of seafood. This is going to yield a diet that is kinder to the planet, more resilient to climate, healthier and more delicious to the consumer, more diverse and rewarding for the producer and the chef, and less costly to the taxpayer. Worldwide aquaculture currently produces about 67 million tonnes of fish and water plants a year, but this is a fraction of its potential. I think it's going to grow 3, 4, maybe even 5-fold by the mid-century. If you think about it, so FAO says that in 2050, where the world is going to be eating about 550 million tonnes of animal or fish protein. Okay, that's a lot more than we're eating today. Now, in order to produce enough grain to feed that many animals, we actually have to discover 3 more North Americas. And if you go on Google Earth, there's not a lot of undiscovered continents, right? So there's a heck of a lot of grain. We need another 3 billion tonnes of grain to feed that many animals. Where's the food going to come from to feed all these animals? Or the feed, I should say. Well, the answer is algae or water plants. In future, huge algae farms on land, at sea and in salt lakes will produce food for people, feed for fish and other animals, fuel for transport, pharmaceuticals, plastics, textiles, and fine chemicals. All the stuff you can produce out of dead fossil algae, i.e. petroleum, you can produce from fresh, living algae. It's another form of agriculture to replace the extractive industries, basically. We can nourish these algae significantly on the waste streams from our cities. So algae become part of the nutrient loop. You then feed them on to humans, to chickens, to fish, whatever. There are more than 30 countries already delving into this technology. I mean, just down the road from me in Canberra, there's an algae farm which is being funded by the German airline Lufthansa. Why? Because they want green fuel to put in their aeroplanes, fuel with a zero carbon footprint. So there's a lot of interest. Most of the world's leading airlines are into this now, and big companies like Boeing and so on. So unusual investors for agriculture, a form of agriculture. We've got a place called Muradell in South Australia that's already producing crude oil. And they've got a target, I think, of 500,000 barrels a year. I think it's not so economic since the price went down. But there's a lot of other things you can produce from algae, not just oil. That's the nice thing about it. You can swap the application of your crop very easily. You can farm these things in tanks. You can farm them on wasteland. You can farm them in salt lakes, in shipping containers, on rafts out in the ocean. They are resilient to climate change, because water temperatures don't change as much as air temperatures, things like that. They can be integrated into urban food systems. And one thing that algae are very, very good at is hoovering out all the metals and the nasty things that are in the waste stream. So you can use them for actually preferentially, phyto-mining your urban waste stream. There's 72,000 species of algae, right? So there's a lot of different creatures to choose from, really. And many of them contain, omega-3s, omega-6s, beta-carotene, all the goodies that your doctor tells you to eat fish for. They can be made into delicious, healthy and sustainable foods as readily as any land-based crop. Now, the world's entire transport fuel needs could in fact be met from an area of 57 million hectares of algae ponds, which is about a quarter the area of Kansas. Right. So, if you want to be the Saudi Arabia of tomorrow, the opportunity is there for you. This is the green renewable solution to the risk that I spoke about of our farms and our transport systems, encountering a savage oil shock. It is going to help our food systems, to help to ensure that our food systems never run out of the kind of energy they need for their daily production. This is the bit that really shocks me. If you go into the biggest market on earth, I don't know where it is, it might be in Amsterdam or somewhere like that, and you count up all the different plant foods that you can see there, you will come up with a list of about 300. We, Homo sapiens, eat about 300 different plants. And we rely very heavily on 5 grains and about 30 vegetables and things like that. We have an extremely narrow, compared to Homo erectus, we have an extremely narrow menu. According to my friend, agronomist, Dr. Bruce French, who's done a global survey, there are 26,700 edible plant species on the planet. So we actually haven't yet explored the earth in terms of what is good to eat. We have just gone ignoring all of this stuff for a long, long time. Many of these edible plants that don't feature in the modern diet are the food of indigenous people. And the knowledge is fragile and will soon be lost. So we have to get onto that very, very quickly. In Australia, we've got 6,100 edible plants. We currently eat 5 of them. It's horrifying. You'll know the macadamia nut. How many others can you name? None, I would expect. But wait until the celebrity chefs get hold of these things, ladies and gentlemen. They're going to take off. They are the food fashion trend of the future. So this can all be done in urban agriculture. Because they're mainly fruits and vegetables, they can be grown in urban farms. They're going to create the new industries, the new jobs. They're going to change the face of food. Your salad is going to be a much more interesting thing in 20 or 30 years' time than it is today. A lot of people go, ugh, when they see this one. Maastricht University produced the world's first cultured sausage in 2011, and then they came up with the hamburger a couple of years later. $350,000 hamburger, so it's not going to put Burger King out of business just yet. But, you know, the point is, it's made from animal stem cells. So it's real beef, it's real pork, it never went moo or oink. It's real meat. It's going to take over the bottom end of the market, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, who knows what is in a sausage anyway? Do you know what is in the hot dog that you ate at the football? Dare you ask? Well, it's going to be this stuff, and I think I'd rather eat this stuff, to be honest with you. So you know, all of the snack foods, the sausages, the pies, you know, all those little crispy things that they fry up to make your heart crook, they're going to be made from this kind of meat. And that's going to allow real beef, real poultry to go up market, free range, organic, you know, and pay the farmer much better. Pay the farmer in a way that enables the farmer to look after the landscape, not just this miserable wage that the farmer everywhere gets from the 24 big food companies in the world, which is what's happening at the moment. We're using money to punish the agricultural ecosystem. And, you know, that's got to change. This could be the break. You know, this and urban food between them are the break that allows, and this is a form of urban food because the livestock are very small, they're just cells, you know. but you can produce a lot of protein, and it can be precisely specified to the health needs of an individual. You know, so if you've got a heart risk in your family and they identify that from your genome, you can be eating healthy meat that is prescribed for you from the word go, you know, instead of taking a risk at the barbecue. So it does open up some very interesting possibilities. By the 2030s, I'm reliably informed by a US company, there will be henless eggs, cowless milk, pigless bacon, and fishless fish. So you know, a lot of this stuff is if you think it's not going to catch on, if you think it won't, have a look at your clothes, right? 60 years ago, nobody wore synthetics, right? Today, every single person has got an item of synthetic on their persons. So, you know, there's been a revolution in apparel. There will be a revolution in food in the same way. Biocultures will transform food. I mean, this is what agricultural scientists have been doing in the laboratory for decades, but it's going to be industrialized. It's going to go large scale to produce, again, healthy food. Cells from plants, fungi, microbes, and animals will be cultured en masse in bioreactors and turned into edible, delicious, and nutritious foods. I mean, just, you see the big steel vat there. I mean, how much land is that occupying? How much water does it actually need? How many nutrients to produce a large volume of food? Compare that with the ancient Roman agricultural system, which we're still trying to prime. You know, the differences are just profound. Then there's all these other whiz-bang technologies. I don't quite know what to make of them myself. 3D printing of food is going to take off. There's at least 8 companies that are into this big time with, you know, the range of customers for this thing apparently are 5-star restaurants to fast food outlets and even vending machines. You know, the vending machine will just go and print out a pavlova and give it to you, you know. I don't know. You can't stop human inventiveness. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, to make all this happen, we cannot have a healthy, sustainable food system unless we have consumers able to make the right choices for themselves and for the earth. It is they who send the dollar signals to make all this happen or to prevent it. So I here call for 1 full year, a food year, in every junior school on the planet. And this is a year when every subject that you study has a food theme, whether it's mathematics, geography, social studies, sport. Where does your energy come from in sport, you know? So everybody learns to appreciate food in the way it was appreciated 3 or 4 or 5 generations ago when it was, you know, life and death issue. People need to learn how to ensure that their food supply never fails, not just buy the stuff thoughtlessly off the shelf of the big company that is not really interested, hasn't got the wider vision on these things. Teaching food is acceptable to all cultures, creeds, races, nations. The means already exist to share these ideas universally. The knowledge already exists. It is starting to happen on social media. I'm starting to see this kind of knowledge spread around the world. Programs going through schools where kids grow their own and then eat it and things like that, changing their attitude to vegetables, for example. We just must make it go faster. Ladies and gentlemen, just as the 70s were the age of rock music, the 90s were the age of the internet, we are entering the age of food. Never has world cuisine been so spectacularly diverse or so far short of its true potential. Never have the opportunities been so many or so great. Urban farming is the bow wave of a worldwide revolution in both food production and in diets. It ushers in unprecedented range and choice of food, the like of which we've never seen before. New ways to produce food that are independent of climate and finite resources like soil and water. A revolution in healthcare, diets that prevent disease. Secure supplies of food for the world's thriving megacities. A major driver of the ideas economy. And by relieving pressure on the world's farming landscapes, a practical way to rewild the earth and end the sixth extinction. Ladies and gentlemen, food is one of the most creative acts which we humans perform. How well we do it will define the future of our civilization now and forever. Thank you.
Do you have questions? Here.
I love your idea about the food year. So any suggestions on how something like that could be accomplished?
Well, I know how difficult it is, having tried many times as an ag journo and things, to change the curriculum. You know, it is guarded by bureaucrats, and I imagine it's here the same here. So rather than change the curriculum, you change the content. So, you know, in mathematics, you just use examples from food. In geography, you accentuate food. So you're not actually changing the curriculum. They're still teaching the same amount of all these different subjects, but you are incorporating more food into the system. And particularly, I think you need to incorporate more things that are hands-on for kids. So Stephanie Alexander, famous Australian chef, has now got a program both in Australia and in the United States, where she's introducing the growing of vegetables and the preparation and cooking of vegetables into schools. And the obvious benefit of that is that kids that hate Brussels sprouts, like, was it George Bush or somebody or other? Who was it? Oh, broccoli, right, okay. But they love it, you know, because they grew it themselves, you know, the enthusiasm is there. And I've been told there were some retired teachers who were taken around schools to introduce children to the fact that milk came from cows and orange juice actually came from oranges, which they didn't know. And the interesting thing there was that these teachers were warned by the regular teachers, when you go into the class, watch out for little Johnny in the back row. He's the troublemaker. He will disrupt your class, you know. But when they got in there and said, look, we're going to make orange juice, we're going to make bread, suddenly little Johnny had a hands-on thing that he could do. And he ceased to be a troublemaker. He became an enthusiast. He was equal with the rest of the class, you know, in this particular thing. So, you know, it changes the dynamic of the classroom to have something. Food is something that kids are familiar with. Most of the other stuff is abstract. You know, chemistry is a very abstract subject to most kids, you know. Indeed, most of the sciences are. You teach them with something that they can touch and which they can identify with from the whole of their lives, you get a much greater level of engagement. So I think it can be good for the educational system as well.
Thank you so much for your talk. I feel like this was really, really inspiring. And you talked in the first part of your presentation about kind of our personal responsibilities around food and being reflexive in terms of what we're doing in our day-to-day lives. But where are the responsibilities for our governments, I guess, and the corporations who are putting out the options that we buy every day based on how much money we have and the means that we're able to do these types of great things.
Yeah, there's a huge tension, isn't there, in modern society, here in America, in Australia, in Britain, and elsewhere. The tension between wealth and democracy, is palpable in all of these countries. And wealth is a very potent force, and it does tend to control governments. Look, the only thing you've got to control governments and corporations is people power. It really is. We know that, I don't know what the situation is with chickens here, but in Australia it's hard to buy a cage-reared egg now because consumers have just swept them from the shelves. Consumer demand for free range has banished an entire system of production. You can think of things, ethical coffee, running shoes that aren't made with slave labor or whatever it is, all these kinds of ethical foods and other products. That's just consumer power. The thing that's happening, which I find absolutely magical, is that for the first time in the whole of human history, we're connecting with one another, human minds, around a planet at the speed of light. We're sharing ideas, we're sharing values, and we're sharing knowledge. And we're also sharing what to do about it. So when the American Breast Cancer Foundation says don't wear these cosmetics because they might give you cancer, that information shows up on Twitter in Australia in a flash. We are starting to think, ladies and gentlemen, as a species. We are like the cells in the brain of an embryo infant in the second trimester, when there's that magical moment when those axons and glia and neurons connect, and you go from a blob of cells to something that is cognate, logical, emotional, with feelings and dreams. Now, we're starting to do that at the species level. I don't know whether this is going to get us out of the hole we're digging for ourselves, but I'm optimistic. I think it can. I think that humans sharing common human values around a planet at light speed can get us through some of the 10 big existential threats that are bearing down on us.
So can we just ask? Yeah, I have a question in the extension room, wherever this is. You talked a lot about this pressure to move into urban agriculture, just how land availability is going to shift that. But then what is your response to trends of land grabs, or how countries like China and India are moving into countries in Africa, especially where there's cheap land, or US seed companies are putting pressure on Indian farmers to move from smallholder systems into large-scale grain farming or poultry farming? It just seems like there's still a lot of pressure right now for farmers to scale up and fit that meat and grain economy, especially in China and India.
Yes, absolutely. Look, we saw world grain stocks come down in the early part of this century, and around about 2008, 2010, it sparked a big panic. We had the rice crisis in Asia, and then grain prices took off around the world. And that did two things. First of all, it drew the attention of the financial world, which was experiencing a pretty rough trot with the GFC and so on. And they were all looking for safe havens to stash their money. So agriculture, which had been the most unfashionable area to invest in for about the previous 50 years, suddenly became fashionable again. Farmland started getting bought up by, it wasn't just China and large corporations, but also universities and all people were buying land in Africa and kicking off the Africans who had farmed this land for 3,000 years but didn't happen to have a title deed to it. So atrocious things were done, the same kind of things that were done in the Dust Bowl era here or in the soldier settlement era in Australia. Farmers were they lost their futures, their families, their jobs. The lot was torn away from them. I think probably one of the most callous acts in human history, really. It's the Highland clearances and the Irish potato famine on a grand scale, and it's still going on. So pardon me if I get a bit heated, but I've worked with farmers all my life and I care about them, and they're getting hammered by this juggernaut machine that pays them less and less for their crops and charges them more and more for their fertiliser and their tractors. Now, if we can start to transfer food production to cities, What you're doing is you're taking food production out of the hands of this globalized food chain, which is basically controlled by just 20 companies, 20 very big companies, and you're putting it back in the hands of small producers and consumers, in a direct relationship with one another in city markets. And so people will talk to the person who produces their vegetables and learn about those vegetables on the street or wherever the vegetables are delivered in the restaurant. That's not happening now. The food chain has divided farmer from consumer, an insuperable array of barriers. So I believe that urban agriculture is actually going to address this issue of the alienation of the consumer from the farmer. It's not going to be easy because people with lots of money are still going to go around the world and grab things. It's very hard to stop them. You can't regulate them because they obey no laws. They don't pay taxes to federal governments. So federal governments worldwide are getting weaker, less powerful, because these big companies don't pay tax or enough tax. And they don't honour the laws and regulations. So the chemical industry is migrating out of Europe and America, where it's regulated, and into Asia, where it's not. And officialdom is easily bribed. So you're seeing all of these sorts of things going on, which are a bit of a worry. The only way to fight back against that is educated consumers and educated voters. Seriously, knowledge is the only nostrum, the only thing that can deal with this issue.
One of the things that strikes me is that I'm not sure that we have that going on in the United States. So I'm kind of interested in your cross-national perspective on what's happening or not happening. Do you have any speculation about some of the Australia?
Oh, look, I have to say it's my impression that you are really at the cutting edge. I get tweets from all the sort of urban farming people in America and Europe and things like that. There is so much excitement here, converting old bowling alleys in New Jersey to aquaponic farms and things like that. I mean, I gave a talk in Chicago a couple of years ago, and I was at a meal with the mayor of Chicago. I said, what does Chicago do for a crust any longer? I mean, you're not making bootleg liquor, and you're not dealing in cattle to quite the same degree as you used to. Where did you earn your income? And she said food, basically. It was Chicago was reinventing itself as a food city, and I thought, what a wonderful idea. And they were going off local fungi and wild berries and things like that, so it was a wonderful example of localization. So many of the high-tech ideas do come from the US. For example, there's a very vibrant algae farming industry here that's trying to get the production systems down for the algal oil and things like that. And as I say, I just read all of the ideas for these vertical farms and things like that, sky farms. A lot of them are coming from your architects who are realizing how dull and boring they've made our cities, and they want green cities, but we need to get in there and say, we don't just want a pretty building, we want one that recycles water and nutrients, please. And then it can grow something that we can use. So, but the ideas are here, but there's a lot of activity in Scandinavia as well. The Brits are into this in a big time, as you would imagine. Germany also. So, but again, it's like I was saying, the ideas are flowing globally on social media mainly. So there's a sharing of knowledge, which is going to change the world happening.
Question from the overflow room. So you talked at the start a little bit about the intersection between our diet and our health. And I know in the US, and I believe in Australia as well, a lot of our problems are from consumer choices on the amount of food really that we eat. Part of that is probably due to a disconnect in sources of food. But you then proceeded to talk about synthetic foods and other sorts of industrially produced foods. So I wonder if you could address the disconnect that I see there between consumers getting closer to their food versus, again, being farther away via technology from their food?
Yeah, look, it's a deep irony, isn't it? I suppose one thing that worries me more than anything, goes back to a previous book I wrote, is the chemicalization of the food process. So 6,000 odd chemicals are used to produce and process food now. And, you know, you're getting a cocktail of those things. I'm amazed at how much petroleum people eat. Mothers feed their kids on brightly coloured sweets, lollies. And they don't know that those things are made from petrochemicals. So the ignorance level is very high among consumers at the moment. Things that are shrink wrapped, for example, there are chemicals, as you know, migrating out of the wrapping into the food. Or plastic. I mean, when babies come into the world, first of all, they've already had a mouthful of pesticides in their mother's milk. You look at the World Health Organization survey of what's in mother's milk, it'll scare the hell out of you. Then they take they start eating real foods, but those foods come in plastic, and so they're getting all the BPA's and the other things. So one thing that we've really got to do is cleanse the food system. Yes, there's the overeating issue, but it's not as easy as just people being sold too much food, although that's part of the issue. It's also the endocrine disrupting chemicals that are in the community. They're throwing the human metabolic system out, and they're causing people to lay down more fat than is necessary. They're actually changing the way you process energy in your body. This is what the medical scientists say. This is not me saying this. So we need to look at exposure. So those are the kind of things that come out of your carpet or out of your furniture. So we're tinkering with our genome chemically in quite frightening ways. And that has to be controlled at the same time as giving people clean, healthy food that hasn't been contaminated by... The issue is not the amount of any individual chemical, as the chemical companies insist. It's the mixture. The mixture is possibly thousands of chemicals a day. You sit behind a truck on the highway, you get 700 different chemicals. You go too close to a smoker, you get 600 chemicals. And it's just that porridge of chemicals that we're imbibing at the moment that is affecting our health. It's a major causative factor in preventable diseases of various kinds, including these epidemics that we're seeing of ADHD, autism, and so on. I'm quoting Harvard now, Harvard University, the amount of neurotoxins that are in the modern diet and living space are affecting children's brains in the formative ages. So we've got to clean these things up. I think government regulation is not going to cut the mustard. Never has, never will. They've always been too slow. We've so far banned in the world 21 chemicals out of 144,000. So it's going to take us 50,000 years to do the rest. Something else has got to happen in this space, and I think that is informed consumers saying, sorry, like the American Breast Cancer Foundation saying, sorry, we don't want that lipstick. It's got yuck in it, So there's a big education task here, but social media is the vehicle to carry these messages and point people at the science, not at the emotion in this, the actual science.
You talked about the issue of conventional food production being concentrated into just a small number of large companies. The hallmark of urban agriculture today, at least in the United States, is the small producers and certainly responding to consumer demand. What's to prevent us, from 50 years from now, if urban agriculture is scaled up and looks like some of the photos that you showed up there, that we won't be in the same boat, that we won't have production controlled by a small number of large firms?
I think you will. But what I envision is the advantage the small producer has is that they can produce some particular commodity, or not even some particular food, very lovingly, and they can spin a story around that food, whatever it is, paddock-reared pork, whatever it is that they grow, they can make a story around, and the consumer will pay more money for that, and they will pay it direct to the producer, thus cutting out all the middle people who take all the money. What's the price of a loaf of bread here? I don't know, $6? Not as much? But anyway, the wheat in it is 30 or 40 cents, isn't it? You know, so the point is there's an awful lot of people taking the middle out of that loaf of bread. The farmer's not getting. So small scale producers will be able to go direct and they'll be able to sell through the internet. Increasingly, they're doing that. I'm seeing that in New York, for example, California. They're doing so. These small farmers are clubbing together and marketing not only direct but also on internet deliveries and things like that. So the whole food system is up for grabs. It's changing. And all right, the supermarket is still a very convenient place to go and just get everything and heave it all in the cart. And the attractions are there, and the deadly low price, the price that is destroying the landscape and destroying the farming communities, is also there in the supermarket. We need to re-educate our children, as I said, to value food much more highly than we do. I mean, when your grandparents were around, 30% of their income was spent on food. You know, 20 years ago, it was more like 15%. Today, it's probably about 10% of disposable household income in developed countries is spent on food. It's been getting smaller and smaller and smaller. We've got to revalue food because it is the one thing that keeps us alive. And I think that can only be done, as I say, by sharing these kinds of messages. I think we've got to listen to our grandmas a bit better.
What can you tell me about how there seems to be, in my opinion, a disconnect between trying to produce enough food for all the people that will sustain our urban cities or even just the country or the world as a whole, and the degree that we completely exclude any other options. This isn't working right. The ethics and natural options, the truly ones that are completely natural, excluding things like aquaculture and aquaponics and all those kinds of things, using natural soil to grow things, that kind of stuff, that requires land area, and it has to be. But when we go to, for example, you've used it a couple times, cage-free eggs take more space to create than do the traditional, or not traditional necessarily, but the recent developments and those kinds of things. I read some really interesting, and again, it was a blogger, so it's going to have a little bit of a spin on it, but it was about a person who went to Costco and had been buying eggs in large quantities due to some of the allergies that her children had. And the higher ups at Costco had completely removed any of the lower cost eggs. Now all the eggs were over $3 a dozen. And though you say that 10% of our disposable income in, say, developed countries like the United States is used for food, I think that's a little distorted when you talk about lower incomes.
Of course, sure.
That's an average. So a lower income person could easily be spending 50% of their income on food. Yep. And that is a really big deal. And so when you remove the dollar a dozen eggs from their choice versus making them buy $3 a dozen eggs, you're not feeding the masses. You're feeding those that can afford to do so.
Yeah, well, the dilemma is if the price of feeding the masses, the 10 billion of us that are going to be here by 2065, is to destroy the environment that produces the food, then it's not a wise investment. Okay, I think there are ways that you could subsidize food quite easily, and you have food stamps here. There are all sorts of ways that you can make food cheap to those who cannot afford food, but we have to start paying the real cost of food, which is the landscape cost of food, the water cost of food, the biodiversity cost of food. All these things are externalized by economics at the moment. That is what is wrong with the world food system. It's a very difficult problem to solve because a lot of people in there with a vested interest in screwing both ends of the thing, the consumer and the farmer. So, but we're going to have to change that. If the economic signal doesn't change, the world food supply is unsustainable. Right? Let us make no mistake about that. We keep on doing this. It's a road to nowhere. Let me offer you the alternative and more optimistic scenario. Okay, around the world, in every country you look at, even in Africa, the fertility rate of women is going down. Women have taken a decision without consulting men, without listening to any of those preachers and journalists and politicians and the baby bribers and things like that. Women are reducing their fertility. It's gone from 4.4 down to 2.4 in the last 40 years. And that's going to keep on going. Around about 2065, if that trend persisted as a straight line, we would actually hit peak people. That would be the peak out of the human population. And we would then be in a position, led by women, to lower the world population to a sustainable level, which, depending on who you listen to, Paul Ehrlich says it's 2 billion, some people say 4 billion, but it depends on the living standard those people get. But if we take the human population down to a lower level of, say, 4 billion, for argument's sake, by 2130, something like that, you can manage it down, then we're not putting too much pressure on the world. It's only when we're up there in the 10 or 11 billion and we're mining the planet of its resources to feed ourselves that we're in very dicey country. So, these are very big questions, but they need to be thought about in a global. It's no good solving the food problem locally any longer because it'll have a knock-on effect somewhere else. And we've got to start seeing this as we're one species on one planet, and if we get it wrong, we're all going to pay the price. So sharing this knowledge, sharing the knowledge that you've got, is immensely important. Getting the new technologies out there, encouraging traditional farmers to invest in urban farms, to bring their knowledge of how to grow things and how to nurture and raise livestock and things into the cities. That's what I say to my farm audiences. I say, go start investing in an urban farm. You might have a ranch and you might have a grain farm. Get an urban farm, right? Balance, because that won't suffer from drought. The other ones will, And they all say, well, right. So, let's share this knowledge as quickly as we can. In agriculture, we're not inhibited by commercial in confidence and all that other rubbish and military secrecy and things. We can share this knowledge freely around the world. The quicker we do that, the more we will solve the problems. Thank you.